You've already worked with the label control several times. Using a label control is probably the easiest and best way to make a piece of text on a page accessible to your C# code. In this lesson, you'll learn more about the capabilities of label controls and about the similar literal control. To begin, open the My Project sample file from your Sample Files folder. And open controlstest.aspx in Design View if it isn't open already. Now add a label control to the page. Now set the ID property of your new control to label test. Set the text property to test label and set the font bold property to true. Most controls that contain text have the same text formatting properties as label controls. Next, add a literal control to the page next to the label control. The literal control looks a little strange. This is because it doesn't have any text, so a placeholder is shown instead. Label and literal controls normally display their text property on the page. Visual Studio adds placeholder text when the text property is empty, as otherwise you wouldn't be able to see the control in Design View. A label control has its text property set to label when it is first created. If you clear the text property of a label control, it will appear in Design View as a placeholder with the label's ID property. A literal control's text property is blank when it is first created. It appears in Design View as literal ID until the text property has been set. When the text property is blank, the control won't actually display any text in the user's browser. To continue, you'll need to set the properties of your new literal control. Set the ID property to literal test and set the text property to test literal. You'll notice that there are a lot fewer properties for a literal control than there are for a label control. You'll see why this is in a moment. To see the difference between the label and literal controls, you'll need to view the page in your browser. However, you changed the start page of this project to mypage.aspx in Lesson 1.8. This means that mypage.aspx will always appear first when you start debugging. To view controlstest.aspx in your web browser, you can either simply right-click on controlstest.aspx in the Solution Explorer and click View in Browser, or start debugging normally and then navigate to controls.aspx using your browser's address bar, or simply change the start page to controlstest.aspx. Whichever method you choose, view controlstest.aspx in your browser. Now view the source of the page. To do this in Internet Explorer, simply right-click on the page and click View Source from the shortcut menu. You can see that the label control has been converted into an HTML span tag by the server. The server has converted the font bold property into inline CSS. The literal control, however, only sends exactly what you put into its text property to the browser. This is the reason why it has so few properties. The server will never change the contents of a literal control in any way. This is useful when you want to use C# code to place HTML code directly onto the page. The label control is the best choice when you simply want to display text in the user's browser. Close your browser now and return to controlstest.aspx in Design View. Now you're going to add a load event handler to the label test control. To do this, select the label test control, click the Events button in the Properties window, and double-click in the empty box next to the Load event. As well as the Load event, you'll notice the Init, Pre-render, and Unload events. These correspond to Page Init, Page Pre-render, and Page Unload, in the same way that Load corresponds to Page Load. You'll also find Data Binding and Disposed in the list of events. Disposed happens when the control is removed from the web server's memory, which will happen after the control has been converted to HTML and sent to the user's web browser. Data binding is a special event that only happens if the control is attached to a data source, such as a SQL database. You'll learn more about binding data to controls in Lesson 11.8. It isn't just the label and literal controls that have these events. They're available on every ASP.NET control. In practice, however, it is very rare to have to use them. You won't need to use any of these events in the rest of this course. To add a load event handler, simply double-click in the empty box next to Load. Now add the following code to the load event handler. Label test.text equals label load event fired. Now view controlstest.aspx in your browser, and you can see that the text property of the label is updated when the page loads. The load events for each control on the page happen immediately after the page load event. You'd see the same effect if you put the code into the page load event handler instead. In general, it's better to use the page load event handler rather than the load event handlers of each individual control. This keeps all of the code that runs when the page loads in the same place. The person viewing your site can't interact directly with label or literal controls, so there are no other important events. Close your web browser now, return to controlstest.aspx in Design View, and remove both the label and the literal control. Now, before ending this lesson, try starting debugging. You'll find that a build error occurs. This is because the event handler code for the label control is left behind even after you delete the control. Before ending this lesson, you'll need to remove the event handler. Click No. Return to the code behind file of controlstest.aspx and simply delete the label test load event handler. If you now try starting debugging again, you can see that there are no more errors. Close your web browser now, and close Visual Studio. You've now completed Lesson 4.3. Use the label and literal controls.